Have you ever carried a weight so heavy that no one else could see it, yet it pressed down on your chest every single day, making it hard to breathe, hard to sleep, hard to simply exist in your own skin? I want to share with you a story about invisible burdens, about the chains we forge in the name of family, and about the extraordinary courage it takes to break free from them. This is my story, but it might also be yours or someone you love, because sometimes the most dangerous prisons are the ones built with love and lined with good intentions. My name is Grace, and for the first 18 years of my life, I lived in what appeared to be a perfectly normal home in a quiet suburb of Denver, Colorado. From the outside, our family looked ideal. 3 generations living in harmony, children who were well behaved, adults who attended church every Sunday and volunteered at community events. But behind our white picket fence and manicured lawn, behind the smiles we wore like masks in public, there existed a world of systematic emotional control that would take me years to understand and even longer to escape from. It all centered around my grandmother, Margaret, a woman who stood barely 5 feet tall, but whose presence could fill an entire house with dread. She had kind eyes when strangers were watching, the sort of grandmother who baked cookies and knitted scarves, who collected porcelain angels and displayed them in a glass cabinet that caught the afternoon light. But those of us who lived under her roof knew a different woman entirely, one who had convinced herself and everyone around her that love meant absolute control, that salvation came through suffering, and that children were inherently sinful creatures who needed to be broken before they could be saved. The rituals began when I was just 5 years old, though I later learned they had been happening long before I was born, passed down through our family like a twisted heirloom. Every full moon, without fail, our extended family would gather in Grandmother Margaret's house, not for celebration or reunion, but for what she called our monthly cleansing. As a small child, I didn't understand why the full moon filled me with such dread, why my stomach would twist into knots as that bright circle rose in the sky. I only knew that it meant another night in the basement, another circle of confession, another test I was destined to fail. The basement itself was ordinary enough. Concrete walls painted a pale yellow that had faded over the years, a water heater that clicked and hummed in the corner, folding chairs arranged in a perfect circle. But to us children, it was a courtroom where we were always guilty, a theater where we performed our shame for an audience that demanded nothing less than complete emotional devastation. The rules were simple yet impossible to follow. Every month we had to confess our sins, not just things we had done wrong, but thoughts we had entertained, moments of joy we had experienced outside the family, any flicker of independence or happiness that hadn't been sanctioned by Grandmother Margaret herself. I was 7 years old when I truly understood what happened to children who couldn't cry on command. My cousin Emma, 2 years older than me and always braver than the rest of us, had made a fatal mistake during that month's cleansing. She had smiled during her math class because she'd solved a problem before anyone else in her grade. When her turn came in the circle, she confessed this moment of pride with a steady voice, admitted to feeling smart and special for those brief 30 seconds before remembering that individual achievement was considered selfishness in our family. But Emma didn't cry. Her voice remained clear and strong as she spoke, and that was her downfall. Grandmother Margaret's face transformed into something cold and terrible, like marble that had been left out in winter. She spoke words that still echo in my nightmares decades later. "No tears means no true repentance," she said, "and those without repentance must face correction." Emma disappeared upstairs with 3 aunts while the rest of us continued our confessions in the basement, trying not to hear the sounds that drifted down through the floorboards. When she returned an hour later, Emma's eyes were swollen shut, purple bruises already forming on her arms, and she couldn't sit properly on her folding chair. She spent the rest of the cleansing standing, swaying slightly, tears finally flowing down her cheeks, though whether from pain or genuine repentance, none of us could tell. After that night, we all learned to cry on command. It became a survival skill as essential as breathing. The rules of our confessions were intricate and merciless. Every joy experienced outside family time was a betrayal that needed to be purged. If you got an A on a test, that was pride, putting school above blood. If you made a friend, that was dividing your loyalty, allowing outsiders to influence your spirit. If you enjoyed a song on the radio, laughed at a joke, or even felt the sun warm on your face during recess, these were all sins that required confession and tears. But the truly insidious part was that we also had to confess thoughts we hadn't yet had, sins we might commit in the future, doubts that could potentially creep into our minds. If your confession list was too short, it meant you were hiding something. Too long, and you were reveling in darkness. We had to find the perfect balance of self-hatred to satisfy our audience. My younger brother Thomas was only 5 when he made his first real confession. He had been happy at recess because he'd gone down the slide fast and the wind had made him laugh. That was the entirety of his sin. A 5-year-old child sobbing because a playground slide had brought him a moment of pure, innocent joy. But his tears weren't desperate enough, weren't convincing enough for the adults who watched our every movement, cataloging our expressions for signs of resistance. My father noticed immediately. He always noticed when the crying didn't ring true. He leaned forward in his chair and spoke to Grandmother Margaret in that low voice that made my skin crawl. "The boy is fighting it," he said. "The resistance is strong in this one." I knew what those words meant. We all knew. Thomas was going to face corrections unless his tears became more convincing in the next 30 seconds. And so I did something that changed everything. Something that would define my role in our twisted family dynamic for years to come. I reached over and pinched Thomas hard on the soft skin under his arm, right where the bruises wouldn't show. He shrieked in genuine pain, real tears flowing immediately, and the adults nodded their approval. "There it is," Grandmother Margaret murmured with satisfaction, the spirit breaking through. From that night forward, I became the pincher, the inflictor of small strategic pains that saved my younger cousins from the larger horrors that waited upstairs. During every cleansing, the little ones would sit near me, and when their tears weren't flowing convincingly enough, when I could see an adult's attention sharpening with suspicion, I would help. A twist of skin here, a sharp fingernail there, whatever it took to produce the authentic distress that would satisfy our audience. I collected their pain in small doses to spare them from the corrections that left bruises for weeks and scars that lasted forever. By the time I turned 13, I had become an expert in the performance of repentance. I kept a mental catalog of sins to confess, carefully spacing them out across months so they seemed natural and spontaneous. I practiced crying in front of my bathroom mirror, learning exactly how to make my voice crack at the right moments, how to let snot run for authenticity, how to make my shoulders shake with apparent grief. But no matter how skilled I became, the full moons came too fast. Every 28 days brought another basement gathering, another circle of confession, another night of measuring tears like currency in an economy of emotional manipulation. The worst part wasn't even the confessions themselves, but what came after. Following each cleansing, we had to thank them. "Thank you for saving me from myself," we would recite in unison. "Thank you for loving me enough to correct my path. Thank you for keeping our family pure." The words tasted like ash in our mouths, but saying them wrong or without enough enthusiasm meant starting the whole process over again. My cousin Daniel once mumbled his gratitude, exhausted after 3 hours of crying and confession. 4 hours later, when the second round of cleansing finally ended at dawn, his gratitude was crystal clear, though his voice was hoarse from screaming and his legs shook from standing in the corner for so long. Things escalated dramatically when my sister Rebecca turned 15. She had always been different from the rest of us, questioning things the rest of us had learned to accept, pushing boundaries in small ways that made my stomach clench with fear for her safety. During one particularly tense cleansing, she did something none of us had ever dared to attempt. She refused to confess anything. She sat in her folding chair, back straight, hands folded in her lap, and when her turn came, she spoke in a clear, calm voice that seemed to echo off the basement walls. "I didn't have any impure thoughts this month," she said. "I only thought about family." It was a lie so bold, so audacious that it took my breath away. The basement fell into a silence so complete you could hear the water heater clicking in the corner, could hear the sharp intake of breath from every adult in the room. Grandmother Margaret stood slowly, her movements deliberate and terrifying, and I knew Rebecca had crossed a line none of us had even dared approach. They kept her upstairs for 3 hours that night. The rest of us continued our confessions, our tears, our carefully orchestrated emotional breakdowns, all while listening to the footsteps above us, the muffled sounds that filtered through the floorboards, the sudden silences that were somehow worse than any scream. When they finally brought Rebecca back down, she was different. Not broken exactly, but careful in a way she'd never been before, measured and cautious like someone walking on ice that might crack at any moment. She confessed beautifully after that, tears streaming at exactly the right moments, her voice breaking with apparent emotion as she cataloged her sins. But I noticed her counting something on her fingers when she thought no one was looking, and I realized she was counting days. Days until she turned 18. Days until she could legally leave. Days until freedom. The October before I turned 16, something shifted in our carefully controlled world. It happened during a cleansing when the basement lights suddenly failed. Not a simple blown fuse like had happened before, but a complete blackout that plunged us into absolute darkness. In that black void, unable to see the watching eyes of adults, unable to gauge their reactions or adjust our performances accordingly, something extraordinary happened. A small voice, I think it belonged to my youngest cousin Lily, whispered into the darkness, "I hate this. I hate them all." In any other circumstance, such words would have meant immediate and severe correction. But in the darkness, with no way to identify the speaker, other voices began to join in. Whispers floated through the black basement like ghosts. "Me too," someone said. "I thought I was the only one," said another. "How do we make it stop?" asked a voice that might have been my brother Thomas, now 8 and already an expert at crying on command. Then the lights blazed back on, harsh and sudden, and we were all crying again, confessing again, playing our assigned roles as if those whispered rebellions had never happened. But something fundamental had shifted in those moments of darkness. We had discovered that we weren't alone in our hatred, that the careful faces we showed each other during family gatherings hid the same desperate desire for escape. We were all prisoners in the same basement, all actors in the same terrible play, and now we knew it. The knowledge was dangerous and thrilling and terrifying all at once. The next morning, I found Rebecca in the garage, organizing boxes with the kind of mechanical precision that meant her mind was elsewhere entirely. She glanced at me, then at the door, checking that we were alone, before continuing her work. I picked up a box and began helping, neither of us speaking about the darkness, about the whispered confessions that had been more honest than anything we'd said in the light. But we didn't need words. The simple act of working together, of acknowledging each other's presence outside the performance of family harmony, was communication enough. Over the following weeks, I began to notice small acts of quiet rebellion spreading through our cousins like a secret infection. Daniel started sitting next to the younger children during family dinners, casually positioning himself to block grandmother Margaret's direct line of sight when they forgot to pray before eating or smiled too broadly at something. Emma, despite the lasting damage from her correction years earlier, began creating subtle distractions during pre-cleansing gatherings, spilling drinks or asking elaborate questions about family history that gave others time to compose themselves, to prepare their tears. Even Thomas, still so young but already so damaged, had started warning cousins when adults were approaching, developing an elaborate system of coughs and cleared throats that sounded natural but carried meaning for those who knew to listen. We were protecting each other without ever discussing it, creating a secret network of small salvations within the larger system of abuse. But protection wasn't enough. We all knew that. We were treating symptoms while the disease raged on, and eventually, even our careful cooperation wouldn't be enough to save us all. The breakthrough came 2 weeks after the darkness confession, as we had begun to call it in our own minds. Rebecca had been assigned to help grandmother Margaret prepare the basement for the next cleansing, a task that usually went to the most trusted, most broken children. I watched her carry down folding chairs, each trip taking longer than necessary, her face carefully blank in that way we'd all perfected. When she finally emerged from the basement, she pulled me into the pantry, checking twice that we were alone before pressing something into my hand. It was a key. Small, brass, ordinary looking except for what it represented. The basement door key. During cleansings, they locked us in from the outside, claiming it was for our own protection, to keep us safe during our spiritual vulnerability. Fire hazard, absolutely. But in our family, spiritual purity trumped physical safety every time. Somehow, impossibly, Rebecca had managed to make a copy. I stared at the key, understanding immediately what she was offering and what it would mean. This wasn't just a potential escape route. It was evidence of premeditation, of rebellion that went beyond momentary weakness. If they found it, the corrections would be beyond anything we'd experienced. But it was also hope, tangible and brass and real, the first actual tool we'd ever had to fight back against the system that trapped us. That night, I showed the key to Daniel. He was the next oldest cousin after Rebecca and me, smart and careful and good at thinking through consequences. He studied the key like it might disappear if he looked away, then handed it back with shaking hands. We both understood what this meant. An escape route existed, but using it would require planning, coordination, and incredible courage. More than that, it would require sacrificing the careful invisibility that had kept us safe within the system. Once we ran, there would be no taking it back. Daniel began the planning with the methodical attention to detail that had helped him survive years of confessions. He mapped the house during family gatherings, memorizing which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck, where adults tended to congregate during different parts of the cleansing ritual. Emma, despite the physical reminders of her early rebellion, documented patterns in her school notebook, disguising the information as history homework. She tracked when adults checked on us, who went where, how long corrections typically lasted, and which adults were most likely to notice unusual behavior. I became the coordinator, the one who connected our growing network of resistance. During family meals, I developed a system of taps on the table. 2 taps meant someone needed help with their performance at the next cleansing. 3 meant we needed to meet. 4 meant danger. Abort whatever you were doing immediately. The younger cousins learned the signals without fully understanding what they meant, following our lead with the blind trust of those who had no other choice. Our first real test came during November's cleansing. Little Rachel, only 6 years old, couldn't produce tears during her confession about laughing at a cartoon character. She sat in her tiny folding chair, voice flat and emotionless as she described how the funny cartoon dog had made her forget that joy should only come from family. Grandmother Margaret's eyes narrowed with the predatory focus we all recognized. I reached toward Rachel, ready to perform my usual role as the pincher, but Daniel was faster. He accidentally knocked over his water glass, sending it rolling toward Rachel with a crash that made her jump and genuinely tear up from surprise. It wasn't much, just a few startled tears, but it was enough to avoid immediate correction. The adults murmured their approval at her emotional breakthrough, and Rachel was able to finish her confession without ascending those terrible stairs. After that success, we developed a whole system of orchestrated accidents, spilled water for sudden scares that produced genuine tears, pressure points on the hand that looked like comforting holds, but actually caused sharp, brief pain. Emma perfected a way of stepping on toes during group prayers that appeared completely accidental, but reliably produced the wince of pain that could be mistaken for spiritual anguish. But our growing sophistication didn't go unnoticed. The adults began to watch us more carefully, cataloging our interactions with a suspicion that made every gesture dangerous. Father started paying particular attention to my role with the younger children, his eyes tracking every movement of my hands during confessions. Aunt Patricia began counting how many times water was spilled during cleansings, making notes in a small leather notebook she carried everywhere. Uncle Robert started checking our arms for marks before we entered the basement, running his fingers along our skin with a clinical detachment that made my skin crawl. The inevitable betrayal came from within our own ranks. Cousin Peter, 11 years old and desperate for approval after months of particularly harsh corrections, had noticed our signals. He'd seen the patterns we thought we'd hidden so carefully. During one especially brutal session where he'd been upstairs for 2 hours, we heard him sobbing out words that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. "They help each other," he cried, his voice carrying clearly through the floorboards. "They have signals. I've seen them planning." The basement went completely silent except for the eternal clicking of the water heater. Even the adults seemed to hold their breath as we listened to Peter's broken voice cataloging our small rebellions, our attempts at protection, our careful system of mutual aid. When Grandmother Margaret's footsteps finally sounded on the stairs, slow and deliberate as an executioner's approach, we all knew our fragile network had been exposed. She surveyed us all with that terrifying smile that never reached her eyes. "How beautiful," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "That you found ways to support each other's purification. Let's explore this together." The new rules came down like hammers. Searches before entering the basement, with adults patting down even the youngest children for contraband. No personal items of any kind allowed in the cleansing circle. Assigned seating that separated allies and placed each child within arm's reach of an adult. And worst of all, corrections would now happen immediately, in front of everyone. No more private trips upstairs where the worst of the horrors could at least happen out of sight. The shame would be public, the pain visible, the breakdown witnessed by all. The night before the new rules went into effect, I couldn't sleep. Rebecca's bed was empty, though I'd heard her come upstairs after the family meeting. I found her in the garage again, but this time she wasn't organizing boxes. She was packing. A small backpack with 2 changes of clothes, money she'd saved from birthday cards that were supposed to go into the family fund, a water bottle, and a picture of all us cousins from last summer before Peter's betrayal, before the darkness confession, before everything went wrong. She hugged me at dawn, her thin arms stronger than they looked, and whispered bus schedules in my ear. route numbers and departure times, transfer stations and final destinations, a litany of escape that sounded like prayer. Then she walked to school like any normal day and never came home. The family exploded into controlled chaos. Police were called with stories of a troubled teenager who'd been talking to strangers online. Search parties were organized with church volunteers who had no idea they were hunting a refugee rather than a runaway. But Rebecca had been smart. She'd left a note claiming she'd met someone online, that she was in love, that she was safe but never coming back. It was just rebellious enough to be believed, just vague enough to prevent tracking, just close enough to the truth to feel authentic. They made us all confess about Rebecca during February's cleansing. What we knew, when we knew it, why we didn't stop her. For once, I didn't have to perform my tears. They were real, flowing from a grief that was equal parts loss and hope. I had lost my strongest ally, my sister who'd been brave enough to make the first real escape. But Rebecca had also proven something vital. The doors could be opened, the house could be left, the family could be defied and survived. One by one, my cousins began to understand what Rebecca's empty chair meant. Daniel's eyes held new calculation as he stared at the space where she should have been sitting. Emma's notebook gained new pages that I suspected had nothing to do with history homework. Even Thomas stopped crying at night, as if he was saving his tears for something more important than nightmares. We had lost our protector, our leader, our bravest voice. But Rebecca had left us something more valuable than her presence. She'd left us proof that the prison doors weren't as solid as we'd believed. The cleansings continued with their new, harsher rules. March brought assigned seating that placed me directly across from Grandmother Margaret, in her line of sight for every moment of confession. Thomas sat between our father and Uncle Robert, trapped by adult bodies that would notice any movement. Daniel ended up near the door, but with Aunt Patricia blocking any possible exit. The corrections happened with brutal efficiency, carried out in the circle while the rest of us watched, unable to look away or even close our eyes without risking our own punishment. That was the night Cousin Rachel finally broke completely. Her confession about enjoying a butterfly in the garden turned into hysterical sobbing that wouldn't stop. But this wasn't the performed tears we'd all mastered. This was a complete psychological collapse, a 7-year-old mind fracturing under the weight of impossible rules and constant fear. She clawed at her own arms, leaving bloody scratches, screaming about being dirty, being wrong, being poisoned by the beauty of a simple butterfly. They carried her upstairs, still screaming, and she never came back to the basement. We learned later that Rachel had been sent to live with Great Aunt Constance, who ran an even stricter household 2 states away, a place where cleansings happened weekly instead of monthly, where corrections were a daily occurrence, where children were kept in complete isolation from the outside world. Rachel's parents called it an opportunity for intensive purification. We called it what it was: exile for those who broke in the wrong way. The message was clear. Complete collapse meant being sent somewhere worse, so we had to maintain the perfect balance of visible distress without actual breakdown. The fear of Great Aunt Constance's house spread through our group like a virus. We all knew the stories, whispered accounts from cousins who'd visited and come back changed, empty in a way that went beyond our trained performances. If our basement was purgatory, Great Aunt Constance's house was hell itself. But the threat also clarified something important. We weren't just trying to escape punishment anymore. We were trying to escape before we broke completely, before they sent us somewhere that would finish the job of destroying whoever we really were inside. April's cleansing introduced another new element to our torture. Grandmother Margaret announced that individual confessions were no longer sufficient. Now we would also confess for each other, reporting the sins we'd witnessed in our siblings and cousins. The circle erupted into chaos as old grudges became weapons. Cousin Michael reported seeing Emma smile at a grocery store clerk the week before. Emma retaliated by revealing that Michael had been hiding candy in his room, eating it at night when he thought everyone was asleep. The younger children, confused and terrified by this new dynamic, began making up sins they thought they'd seen, trying desperately to please the adults by offering fictional transgressions. I reported that Peter had been exemplary in his devotion, that I'd witnessed no sins, no moments of unsanctioned joy or independent thought. It was a risk, but I couldn't bring myself to throw him to the wolves, despite his betrayal of our network. He looked at me with eyes that held too much understanding for an 11-year-old, and when his turn came, he returned the favor. He praised my constant vigilance against temptation, my dedication to family purity, my example of proper submission. Grandmother Margaret's eyes narrowed at our mutual protection, but she couldn't punish us for lacking accusations against each other. Others weren't so fortunate. The corrections that night lasted until dawn, and two more cousins were sent to Great Aunt Constance's house. The basement felt emptier each month, our circle shrinking as children disappeared into exile or, in Rebecca's case, into freedom. But those of us who remained grew closer in our shared determination to survive and eventually escape. The empty chairs around the circle served as both warning and inspiration, reminders of what happened to those who broke and those who ran. Summer arrived with its own unique challenges. School was out, which meant constant supervision and no respite from family control. We were assigned work projects that kept us busy from sunrise to sunset, always under the watchful eyes of adults who'd grown paranoid after Rebecca's escape. The buddy system extended to sleeping arrangements, with younger cousins bunking with older ones who were responsible for preventing any nighttime escape attempts. They paired me with Peter, a cruel irony that I suspected was intentional. Peter and I shared a room, taking shifts staying awake to watch each other, ensuring neither of us tried to leave during the night. But in those dark hours, something unexpected happened. We began to talk, whispered conversations about nothing at first, then gradually about the basement, the confessions, the life we were all trapped in. I learned that Peter's betrayal had come during a correction so severe, he still couldn't fully straighten his left arm. He'd held out for hours before breaking, and the guilt of giving up our network was eating him alive. During a family picnic in June, while adults supervised food preparation and younger cousins played supervised games, Emma found a way to communicate with our remaining network. She created a clapping game with the little ones, teaching them a simple rhythm that seemed like innocent childhood play. But for those of us who knew to listen, the pattern contained messages. Meeting tonight, basement, important. We played along, clapping and laughing like normal children enjoying a summer day, all while receiving coded instructions for a gathering that could change everything. That night, while adults socialized on the back porch, we met in the basement, the very room that served as our monthly torture chamber transformed into a space for planning revolution. 7 of us remained from the original group that had whispered in the darkness, plus Peter and 2 younger cousins who'd recently aged into understanding. Emma had discovered something crucial during her assigned cleaning duties in the main house. She'd found train schedules in her mother's room, multiple cities highlighted, correspondence with Great Aunt Constance about transferring more children to her facility. We had weeks, maybe a month at most, before several of us would be sent away permanently. Thomas spoke first, which surprised everyone. My little brother had grown in the months since Rebecca's escape, finding strength and survival that none of us had expected from someone so young. He proposed using the July cleansing as cover for a mass escape. The adults would be focused on the ritual, their guard down slightly as they participated in the emotional drama they'd created. If we timed it right, if we coordinated perfectly, we might be able to get several of us out at once. But Peter shook his head, revealing what we'd all suspected but hoped wasn't true. They'd changed the locks after Rebecca's escape. The key she'd risked so much to copy was now useless. Emma had expected this. From her pocket, she pulled out her little sister's coloring book, pages covered in childish scribbles that looked like nothing more than a 6-year-old's art project. But as she explained the patterns, we realized she'd been documenting maintenance schedules, tracking when various exits were accessible, which doors were left unlocked during different family activities. The basement had a storm door exit that was usually locked from the outside, but during cleansings, when all the adults were inside participating, it remained accessible. It was a small window of opportunity, but it might be enough. We spent hours planning every detail. The disruption would have to be perfectly timed, dramatic enough to scatter the adults, but not so violent that it resulted in immediate lockdown. We assigned roles based on where each person would be sitting in the circle. I would initiate the chaos, being positioned closest to Grandmother Margaret and most likely to create maximum disruption. Emma would shepherd the younger kids toward the storm door. Thomas would block pursuit, using his small size to dart between adults and create obstacles. Daniel would head for the main stairs, creating a false trail that might divide the adults' attention. And Peter volunteered to stay behind. He would be the one who raised the alarm, who tried to stop us, who performed the role of loyal family member trying to prevent catastrophe. His previous betrayal would make this believable, might even earn him enough trust to avoid severe correction. It would also provide cover for any of us who didn't make it out, who could claim they were trying to help Peter stop the escapees rather than join them. I wanted to refuse his sacrifice, but the logic was unassailable. Someone had to stay, and Peter's history made him the perfect candidate. June passed in a blur of secret preparation. We practiced during family activities, testing how quickly we could move, how much noise we could make, how long it took adults to respond to disruption. Emma refined her storm door intelligence, confirming it remained unlocked during gatherings. Thomas built his strength with subtle exercises, preparing for his blocking role. I worked with Peter on his performance, teaching him advanced emotional manipulation techniques that would help sell his loyalty act. He learned quickly, understanding that his tears would need to convey not just sorrow, but shock, betrayal, desperate attempts to maintain family order. The night before July's cleansing, none of us slept. We'd hidden supplies in various locations around the property. Money tucked into shoes, bus schedules memorized, meeting points established for those who made it out. Emma had managed to get contact information for Daniel's older brother, who'd escaped to college years ago and never returned, not even for holidays. He'd agreed to help any cousin who reached him, no questions asked. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was more than we'd ever had before. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the familiar dread of cleansing day. Breakfast tasted like sand, but we forced it down, maintaining normal appearances while our hearts hammered with anticipation and terror. During pre-cleansing preparations, I caught Grandmother Margaret watching me with an expression I couldn't read. There was something knowing in her eyes, as if she could sense the rebellion brewing in her carefully controlled family. Her smile held promises of corrections I didn't want to imagine, but I smiled back, playing the role of the broken, compliant granddaughter one last time. We filed into the basement as evening fell, taking our assigned seats in the circle that had defined our lives for so long. The routine began as it always did, with Grandmother Margaret leading us in a prayer for purification, for the strength to confess our sins, for the wisdom to accept our corrections. But as the prayer ended and the first confession began, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The adults seemed different tonight, more alert, their positions slightly changed. Uncle Robert stood by the storm door instead of his usual place by the main stairs. Aunt Patricia had positioned herself between Emma and the younger children. Father stood directly behind Thomas's chair. They knew. Somehow, impossibly, they knew something was planned. I glanced at Peter, whose face had gone pale with the same realization. Our eyes met across the circle, and in that moment, we both understood that our plan was already compromised. But we also understood that this might be our only chance. If we didn't act tonight, we might never get another opportunity. The confessions continued around the circle, each child performing their rehearsed emotional breakdown. But the tension was building like pressure in a pot about to explode. When my turn came, I stood up slowly, my legs shaking with genuine fear rather than performed emotion. I opened my mouth to begin my litany of false sins, but instead, I screamed. Not the controlled theatrical crying we'd all mastered, but a raw, primal sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs. It was 18 years of suppressed rage given voice, 18 years of stolen joy and manufactured shame erupting in a single moment. The circle erupted into chaos. Some children, responding to the signal, jumped from their chairs. Others, too frightened or confused, remained frozen. Emma tried to reach the little ones, but found Aunt Patricia blocking her path. Thomas darted between the adults as planned, but Father caught him within seconds, his small body no match for adult strength. In the confusion, someone knocked over the candles that provided mood lighting for our confessions. The basement plunged into semi-darkness, lit only by the single overhead bulb that cast harsh shadows on the chaos. Adults shouted for order while children screamed and scattered. I heard Peter's voice rising above the noise, playing his part perfectly, yelling for everyone to stop, to think about what they were doing to the family. But in the darkness and chaos, with bodies pushing in every direction, something unexpected happened. The main door burst open, not from inside but from outside. New voices filled the basement, adult voices but different from our family's measured tones. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and I heard someone shout, "Police! Nobody move." The chaos intensified but in a different way, adults stepping back, children freezing in place, everyone suddenly unsure what was happening. Through the confusion, I saw Rebecca. My sister stood in the doorway with 2 police officers and a woman in a suit who looked like social services. Rebecca, who we thought had disappeared into the world, who had actually been building a case, gathering evidence, finding adults who would listen and believe. The rest of that night blurred together in a series of disconnected images. Police officers separating children from adults, asking gentle questions, taking photographs of bruises we'd hidden for years. Social workers wrapping blankets around shoulders, speaking in calm voices about safety and temporary placements. Grandmother Margaret being read her rights while maintaining that everything she'd done was for our own good, that she was saving our souls. Parents torn between defending the family system and protecting themselves legally. And through it all, Rebecca moving among us cousins, checking on each one, whispering that it was over, that we were safe, that the basement would never hold us again. I learned later that Rebecca had spent months after her escape building a case with authorities. She'd documented everything she could remember, provided dates and details, worked with lawyers who specialized in religious abuse cases. She'd connected with other family members who'd been exiled years ago for questioning the system, building a network of witnesses. When she learned through these connections that several of us were scheduled to be sent to Great Aunt Constance's facility, she knew she couldn't wait any longer. The raid had been planned for weeks, timed for when the maximum number of children would be present and evidence of abuse would be most clear. Not all of us left with the authorities that night. Some of the younger cousins, too indoctrinated to see the rescue for what it was, clung to their parents and refused to go. Some parents grabbed their children and fled, disappearing into the night before legal proceedings could begin. But 7 of us went with the social workers, 7 cousins who'd whispered in the darkness about freedom and finally found it, though not in the way we'd planned. We were placed in emergency foster care, some together, some separately, but all safe from the basement for the first time in our lives. The legal proceedings took months. Some parents cooperated, admitting in therapy that they'd perpetuated a system they'd grown up in without questioning its damage. Others fought viciously, hiring lawyers, claiming religious persecution, painting us children as liars and troublemakers. Grandmother Margaret never admitted wrongdoing, maintaining until her death years later that she'd only been trying to save us from ourselves. The family fractured completely, some members supporting the children, others rallying around the adults, most simply disappearing into their own lives and pretending none of it had ever happened. I was placed with the Andersons, an older couple who'd fostered traumatized children before. They understood that healing wasn't linear, that some nights I would wake up convinced I was late for cleansing, that certain sounds could send me into panic attacks, that learning to feel joy without guilt would take years of patient work. They never pushed, never demanded explanations, just provided consistent safety and gentle support, while I slowly learned to exist without constant fear. Mrs. Anderson played piano, and eventually she began teaching me. Music became a language for processing trauma that words couldn't touch. The structure of scales and chords provided order without control, beauty without punishment. Playing piano became a form of meditation, a way to be present in my body without the hypervigilance that had kept me alive for so long. Through music, I began to discover who I might have been without the basement, who I still could become. Thomas was placed with a family 2 towns over, but we saw each other regularly. He struggled more than I did at first, his younger age meaning the trauma was more deeply embedded, harder to separate from normal childhood development. But he was also resilient in the way children can be when given proper support. He threw himself into sports, finding in physical activity a way to reconnect with his body that didn't involve pain or performance. His foster family was patient with his night terrors, his food hoarding, his need to check and recheck that doors weren't locked from the outside. Emma ended up in a group home initially, her age making foster placement more difficult. But she thrived in the structured environment, finally able to use her organizational skills for something positive. She became a mentor to younger kids in the system, teaching them the same protective strategies she'd developed, but for navigating foster care instead of family abuse. Her notebooks transformed from documentation of trauma to plans for the future, college applications, career goals, dreams that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with living. Daniel found his way to his older brother, the one who'd escaped to college and never looked back. Their reunion was complicated, years of separation and different traumas creating distance that love alone couldn't bridge. But they worked at it, attending family therapy, learning to be brothers outside the system that had defined their relationship. Daniel threw himself into academics, finding in education the kind of achievement that had been forbidden in our family. Every A on a test was a small rebellion, every award a refutation of the idea that individual success was selfish. Peter's situation was the most complex. His decision to stay and raise the alarm had protected him legally but destroyed him emotionally. The guilt of his original betrayal combined with the knowledge that he'd helped some of us escape, while others remained trapped, created a psychological burden no 13-year-old should carry. He was placed in intensive therapy, working with specialists who understood the unique dynamics of cult-like family systems. Progress was slow, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs in equal measure, but gradually Peter began to forgive himself for the impossible choices he'd been forced to make. Even Rachel, broken little Rachel who'd been sent to Great Aunt Constance's facility, was eventually freed. The investigation into our family had expanded to include all connected households, revealing a network of abuse that stretched across state lines. Rachel was removed from Great Aunt Constance's care and placed in a therapeutic facility that specialized in treating severe childhood trauma. It would take years before she could function normally, but she was alive and safe and receiving actual help instead of corrections. The first time we all gathered outside the family system was at Rebecca's high school graduation. She'd managed to complete her degree despite everything, maintaining perfect grades while dealing with legal proceedings, therapy, and the complexity of being both victim and hero in our family's collapse. We sat in the auditorium, 7 cousins who'd survived the basement, watching our bravest member walk across the stage in cap and gown. When she smiled at us from the platform, diploma in hand, we all cried real tears for the first time in our lives. Tears of joy, of pride, of emotions we were still learning to feel without shame. Recovery wasn't linear for any of us. We all struggled with different aspects of normal life. I couldn't handle authority figures who reminded me of grandmother Margaret, breaking down in tears when a strict teacher raised their voice. Thomas hoarded food in his room for months, unable to believe it would always be freely available. Emma had panic attacks in enclosed spaces, the memory of the basement making elevators and small rooms unbearable. Daniel struggled with perfectionism, still unconsciously believing that any mistake would result in punishment. But we also discovered strengths we hadn't known we possessed. The hypervigilance that had kept us safe transformed into unusual empathy, an ability to read people and situations that served us well in healthier contexts. The performance skills we developed became useful in job interviews, public speaking, navigating social situations that required a degree of emotional regulation. The bonds we'd formed under trauma evolved into a chosen family that understood each other in ways no one else could. I went to college on a scholarship for foster youth, studying social work with a focus on religious trauma and family abuse. The basement had taken so much from me, but it had also given me a mission, a clear understanding of the help that children in similar situations desperately needed. My professors were sometimes alarmed by my insights into abuse dynamics, the way I could predict patterns and identify warning signs that seemed invisible to others. But my personal experience made me effective in ways traditional education alone never could have. During my junior year, I was asked to speak at a conference on religious abuse in closed family systems. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of social workers, therapists, and law enforcement officials, I thought about all the full moons that had passed since our escape. They were just lunar cycles now, astronomical events with no power to summon dread or trigger preparation for performance. But I also thought about the children still trapped in basements, both literal and metaphorical, still crying on command, still confessing to sins that were nothing more than normal human emotions. I told our story that day, not just the horror, but the hope. I explained how 7 cousins had found ways to protect each other within an impossible system, how we'd developed a secret language of protection, how even in the darkest moments there had been sparks of rebellion that eventually grew into freedom. I talked about Rebecca's courage in seeking help, about the social workers who'd believed her, about the foster families who'd provided safe spaces for us to heal. But mostly I talked about the importance of listening to children, of believing their tears might mean something more than simple childhood distress. After the conference, a woman approached me. She was a teacher, she said, and she had students who reminded her of my story. Children who flinched at unexpected movements, who seemed to perform their emotions rather than feel them, who talked about family gatherings with a tension that felt wrong. She wanted to know what signs to look for, how to help without making things worse, when to involve authorities. We talked for hours, and by the end, she had a list of resources and warning signs that might help her identify and assist children trapped in similar situations. That conversation led to others. Teachers, counselors, nurses, neighbors who suspected something was wrong but didn't know how to help. I began conducting trainings, sharing not just my story but the practical knowledge that came from surviving it. How abusers use religious language to justify control. How children in these systems learn to perform emotions while disconnecting from actual feelings. How isolation and shame work together to prevent disclosure. How helpers could create safe opportunities for children to seek help without directly confronting the abuse. 5 years after our escape, I returned to our old neighborhood for the first time. The house had been sold, the new owners completely unaware of its history. They'd renovated extensively, opening up the basement, installing larger windows, painting everything in bright, cheerful colors. Children played in the yard, their laughter genuine and unrestrained. The basement where we'd performed our confessions was now a playroom, filled with toys and games and natural light. It was just a house now, no longer a prison. I stood on the sidewalk, remembering all the times I'd dreamed of running down this street, of escaping into a world that seemed impossibly far away. The world had been right there all along, just beyond the property line, waiting for us to find the courage to reach it. But courage alone hadn't been enough. It had taken Rebecca's sacrifice, the authorities' intervention, foster families willing to help us heal, and years of patient work to truly escape not just the physical basement, but the psychological one we'd carried with us. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. He was coaching Little League now, teaching kids the joy of sports without the pressure of perfection. The photo showed him surrounded by laughing children, his smile genuine in a way it never could have been during our childhood. Emma had just been accepted to graduate school, planning to become a therapist specializing in religious trauma. Daniel was in law school, focused on children's rights and family law. Even Peter, struggling Peter, had found his path, working as a counselor in a group home for teenagers aging out of foster care. We'd all found ways to transform our trauma into purpose, to use our broken pieces to build bridges for others. The basement had shaped us, marked us, left scars both visible and invisible. But it hadn't defined us. We were more than the sum of our confessions, more than the tears we'd cried on command, more than the children who'd whispered hatred in the darkness. We were survivors who'd become thrivers, each in our own way, each on our own timeline. 10 years after our escape, Rebecca organized a reunion. Not in anyone's home, the idea of gathering in a house still too loaded with meaning, but in a public park on a bright Sunday afternoon. We brought partners, friends, chosen family who'd helped us become who we were meant to be. Some brought children, little ones who would never know the weight of forced confessions or the fear of monthly cleansings. They ran freely through the park, their joy uncomplicated and unmonitored, their laughter rising into the sky like birds we'd finally learned to free. Looking around at my cousins, my chosen siblings forged in trauma but defined by triumph, I thought about Grandmother Margaret. She'd died 3 years earlier, unrepentant to the end, still convinced she'd been saving our souls. I'd felt nothing when I heard the news, neither joy nor sorrow, just a quiet recognition that her power had ended long before her life. She'd wanted to control us, to shape us into perfect vessels for her twisted vision of purity. Instead, she'd created rebels, survivors, helpers who understood darkness intimately enough to guide others toward light. As the sun set over our gathering, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, someone mentioned that it would be a full moon that night. Once those words would have sent us into panicked preparation, checking our confession lists, preparing our tears. Now we simply noted it as an astronomical fact, no more significant than tomorrow's weather forecast. The moon had lost its power over us, reduced to what it had always been, a celestial body following its ancient pattern, beautiful and distant and completely unable to summon us to any basement ever again. That night, I stood outside my apartment looking up at the full moon. It hung bright and serene in the clear sky, and I felt nothing but appreciation for its beauty. No dread, no muscle memory of tears, no phantom pain from long-healed pinches. Just a woman looking at the moon, free to feel or not feel whatever came naturally. The basement was gone, the circle broken, the confessions ended. And in their place, we'd built lives full of chosen joy, earned peace, and the radical rebellion of being exactly who we were meant to be. The ripples of our escape continued spreading outward, touching lives we'd never know. Other families came forward with similar stories, finding courage in our public testimony to speak their own truths. Laws were changed, awareness raised, systems put in place to better protect children in isolated religious communities. Training programs I'd helped develop were implemented across multiple states, teaching mandatory reporters how to recognize signs of systematic emotional abuse hiding behind religious language. Our story became a case study in textbooks, a cautionary tale with a hopeful ending that showed both the damage of unchecked power and the resilience of the human spirit. Sometimes I received letters from other survivors, people who'd seen me speak or read about our case and recognized their own experiences in our story. They wrote about their own basements, their own circles, their own forced confessions. Some were still trapped, writing secretly and destroying the letters after sending them. Others had found freedom but struggled with the aftermath, the complex grief of losing a family that had never really been safe, but was still the only family they'd known. I answered every letter, remembering how isolated we'd felt, how impossible escape had seemed until it happened. The work was hard, often triggering, always emotional. There were days when examining new cases brought back my own memories too vividly, when I could feel the basement's chill despite sitting in a warm office. But there were also days of incredible joy, when a child found safety, when a family broke free from generational patterns, when someone who'd been crying on command for years finally shed tears of genuine relief. Those victories sustained me, reminded me why we'd fought so hard to escape, why sharing our story despite the pain mattered so deeply. 15 years after our escape, I was asked to consult on a case that felt eerily familiar. A teacher had noticed concerning patterns in several siblings from the same family, emotional performances that didn't match their circumstances, references to family gatherings that filled them with visible dread, bruises hidden under clothing and explained away with increasingly elaborate stories. The investigation revealed another basement, another circle, another family using religious control to break their children's spirits. But this time, the system was ready. The children were removed quickly, placed with foster families trained in religious trauma, given immediate access to specialized therapy. The oldest child, a teenage girl who reminded me painfully of Rebecca, had been planning her own escape when the authorities intervened. She'd hidden money, researched bus routes, prepared to run with no certainty of where she'd go or who would help her. When I met with her during the investigation, she asked me the question I'd asked myself 1,000 times. Why did it take so long for someone to notice, for someone to help? I told her the truth, that isolation is powerful, that abusers are skilled at hiding their control behind acceptable facades, that children are taught not to trust their own perceptions of wrongness. But I also told her that things were changing, that every survivor who spoke out made it easier for the next one to be believed, that her siblings would have a chance at healing. She'd been denied for too long. We sat together in that safe, bright room so different from any basement, and I watched her shoulders slowly relax as she realized the performance was over. No more crying on command, no more confessing normal emotions as sins, no more measuring her worth in tears. The freedom was overwhelming, I knew, almost as terrifying as the abuse itself. But I also knew she'd find her way through it, just as we had, one genuine emotion at a time, one choice made without fear of correction, one full moon passing without summoning dread. The cycles of abuse could be broken. We were living proof. 7 cousins who'd whispered rebellion in the darkness and found allies in the light. Foster families who'd provided safe harbor while we learned to navigate freedom. Therapists who'd helped us untangle the lies from the truth, the performance from the person, the trauma from the identity. A network of survivors and supporters who understood that healing wasn't a destination but a journey, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, always worth taking. 20 years have passed now since that night when police lights flooded our basement and Rebecca's courage set us free. 20 years of full moons that came and went without power, of tears shed for real reasons, of joy felt without shame. We're scattered across the country now, living lives that would have been impossible under Grandmother Margaret's control. Teachers and social workers, lawyers and counselors, parents and partners, each of us carrying our history but not being crushed by it. Every month when the full moon rises, I think about the children still trapped in basements, both literal and metaphorical, the ones performing their pain for audiences that demand tears, confessing to sins that are simply human experiences, learning that love comes with conditions impossible to meet. But I also think about the growing network of people who understand, who watch for signs, who believe children when they finally find words for their unspeakable experiences. The basement couldn't hold us forever. The circle couldn't contain our spirits. The confessions couldn't erase who we really were beneath the performance. And somewhere tonight, as the moon rises full and bright, another child might be whispering in the darkness that they hate this, that they want it to stop, that there has to be another way. And maybe, because of Rebecca's bravery and our shared story and all the people who've learned to look beyond the surface, that child will find an ally, a teacher who notices, a neighbor who asks the right questions, a relative who refuses to participate in the performance. Maybe they'll find their own version of police lights flooding the basement, their own path to freedom, their own chance to discover that the moon is just a moon and tears are just tears, and they are so much more than anyone ever told them they were allowed to be. The last time I saw Peter, he was working at a youth shelter, teaching kids who'd aged out of foster care how to navigate adult life. He'd found his redemption in service, transforming his guilt over that long-ago betrayal into fierce advocacy for children with nowhere else to turn. We sat in a coffee shop, two adults who'd once huddled together in enforced sleepovers, watching each other for signs of escape. Now we watch the world for signs of children who needed what we'd found: freedom, safety, the radical permission to exist without performing pain. He told me about a kid he was working with, a teenager who'd run from a family situation that sounded heartbreakingly familiar. The boy flinched at authority, performed emotions rather than feeling them, carried himself with the exhausted wariness of someone who'd learned that love always came with impossible conditions. Peter was teaching him life skills. But more than that, he was teaching him that survival didn't require performance, that safety could exist without surveillance, that some people could be trusted with the truth of who you really were beneath the carefully constructed facade. As we parted ways, Peter hugged me, something that would have been unthinkable in our childhood, where physical contact was either punishment or performance. He whispered thank you, though I'd never been sure what he was thanking me for not reporting his sins that night in the circle, for teaching him to cry convincingly enough to avoid worse punishment, for including him in our escape plans despite his betrayal, or maybe just for surviving alongside him, for proving that there was life after the basement, forgiveness after forced confession, genuine connection after years of performed emotion. I carry all of us with me now, 7 cousins bound by trauma but not broken by it. Rebecca's courage lives in every presentation I give about recognizing abuse. Thomas's resilience echoes in every child I help find safety. Emma's careful documentation inspired the tracking systems we use to build cases against abusers. Daniel's strategic thinking shapes the legal approaches we recommend. Peter's redemption reminds me that healing isn't linear, that people can change, that even those who hurt us in their own pain deserve the chance to make amends. And the little ones who are too young to fully understand what we escaped, they remind me why the work matters. Why every child deserves to grow up free from the weight of forced confession. The basement is gone now, demolished in the renovation that turned our prison into someone else's playroom. But its lessons remain, twisted into wisdom, pain transformed into purpose, darkness that taught us to recognize and create light. We who once cried on command now help others find their authentic voices. We who once confessed manufactured sins now speak truth to power. We who once whispered hatred in the darkness now shout love and support into the light. This is our story, but it's also bigger than us. It's the story of every child trapped in a system that demands performance instead of personhood, that mistakes control for love, that uses isolation and shame as tools of power. It's the story of resilience and rebellion, of finding allies in unexpected places, of discovering that freedom is possible even when the doors seem locked from the outside. It's a story that continues every time someone notices a child's performed tears and asks if they're okay, really okay, not just performing okay for an audience that demands nothing less than perfect submission. If you've made it this far in my story, maybe it's because you recognize something in it. Maybe you have your own basement, your own circle, your own full moons that summon dread. Or maybe you know someone who does. A child who flinches too easily, who cries too perfectly, who speaks about family with words that sound rehearsed rather than real. If so, know this: the basement doors can be opened, the circles can be broken, the confessions can end. It takes courage and allies, and often more pain before it gets better. But freedom exists, and healing is possible, and there are people who understand, who believe, who can help. The moon is full again tonight, sailing serene through a clear sky, and I feel nothing but peace. Somewhere, children might be gathering in circles, preparing their tears, confessing their humanity as sin. But somewhere else, survivors are healing, helpers are watching, systems are changing. The light is spreading, one escaped child at a time, one believed story at a time, one broken circle at a time. And that gives me hope, real hope, not performed but genuine, not demanded but freely felt, as natural and powerful as the moon itself, pulling the tide of change ever forward. To those still trapped, we see you, even in the darkness. To those who've escaped, your survival is victory enough. To those who help, your belief saves lives. And to Rebecca, wherever you are tonight, thank you for being brave enough to run, smart enough to get help, and loving enough to come back for the rest of us. You taught us that sometimes the greatest rebellion is simply refusing to perform pain for those who feed on it, choosing instead to feel what's real, even when what's real is the terrifying, exhilarating, absolutely authentic freedom of being. Nobody's confession but your own. The story continues with each of us, with each child who finds freedom, with each adult who chooses to look closer, to ask questions, to believe the unbelievable. We are not unique in our suffering, but we are proof that suffering doesn't have to be forever, that basements can be escaped, that circles can be broken, that confessions can transform from performed shame into spoken truth. The full moon shines on, but it summons no one to any basement anymore. Instead, it illuminates a world where children can be children, where tears mean what they're supposed to mean, where love doesn't require performance and freedom isn't a rebellion but a birthright. And that's the real confession, the only one that matters anymore. We survived, we escaped, we healed, and because of that, others will too. The basement couldn't hold us, the circle couldn't contain us, the forced tears couldn't drown us. We rose like the moon itself, full and bright and completely, authentically, finally free.